Magic the Gathering has existed for over 30 years, and over that time, they've released tons of different expansion sets. And some of them suck. These sets can introduce a ton of annoying and unfun mechanics, or they could introduce cards and mechanics that completely break the game, or they can just be overpriced. While it's obviously very easy to just sit back and rip on a set, there were tons of passionate people who worked on every single subpar set, and I'm sure that everybody has that one set that had a lot of cool ideas in it that you really wish could have been executed better. And for me, that set has to be Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate. It's a set that had such a fantastic idea behind it, but due to a variety of problems, it failed instead. And today, I'd like to go over the many causes that I think contributed to this set failing in the way it did. First, let me explain the context for this set. Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate was the sequel to the set Commander Legends, which was released initially on November 20th, 2020, and it was the very first time that Wizards of the Coast had designed a draftable Commander set. For those unaware, Commander is a constructed format with a very unique gimmick. Instead of being a traditional 1 vs 1 game of Magic, Commander is instead designed to be a casual, multiplayer format, with players constructing their decks around a specific legendary creature as their commander, and they have access to this commander throughout the entire game. At the time of release, and also the time of making this video, Commander is the most popular way to play Magic the Gathering. So creating a draftable experience for the format was a slam dunk. For the most part, players really enjoyed the set. It contained fun and powerful new cards, a generally fun, albeit a little bit grindy draft experience, callbacks to iconic Magic lore and characters, and reprints of highly valuable cards. The only real major criticisms were the cartoonishly bad foils, which just curled like they were Pringles, and generally people being somewhat disappointed that the first time we ever got a draftable Commander set was in 2020, i.e. the height of the pandemic. So many people actually didn't get to experience the fun of drafting this set. But despite all that, the set was incredibly popular, so there was no doubt in anybody's mind that there would be a sequel sometime in the future. Along with being a sequel to the original Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate also served as the sequel to the set Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. Adventures in the Forgotten Realm was the very first non-Magic the Gathering IP to get a full set dedicated to it, with the expansion taking place in the Forgotten Realms from the ever-popular Dungeons & Dragons. Before this, Magic also had some collaborations with The Walking Dead and Godzilla, but neither had the pedigree of getting a fully unique set designed around them. Adventures in the Forgotten Realm had somewhat mixed reviews, however, with many being somewhat disappointed by the lack of powerful cards in the set. However, most were able to still appreciate the fact that the set did a great job at capturing the world of Dungeons & Dragons. And many people saw the set for what it was supposed to be, a way to get Dungeons & Dragons fans into Magic the Gathering. So, Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate was set to be a combination of these two, creating another Commander draft experience, but this time using the backdrop of Dungeons & Dragons. On paper, this idea sounds great. You take Magic's most popular format and combine it with a very popular outside IP. Seems like a recipe for success. However, as you can tell by the existence of this video, the set performed poorly, and many consider it to be one of Magic the Gathering's biggest flops. It was clear that something went wrong, and that the general audience of Magic the Gathering had some issues with this set. So what were those issues? Sequels are weird, since you as the creator have to expand upon the original material in some way, but you also can't stray too far away or else you could alienate fans of the original. And this can be pretty difficult, especially for something like a movie or a TV show where generally there's a definitive end to a story. But for the most part, games are usually able to have pretty good sequels. Albeit not every sequel, but for the most part they're good. Since with games you just need to fit within the general mechanical expectations of the audience. For instance, we have a general expectation that if you are playing a mainline Mario game, then you're going to be jumping. Be it 2D or 3D in the Mushroom Kingdom or in outer space, if I'm playing a Mario game, I'm gonna be jumping. And whenever there is a Mario game that doesn't involve jumping, it's pretty clear from the title that that's the case. For example, in Mario Tennis, I am expecting to play tennis. I would not be expecting to play a 2D platformer. The same is true for Magic the Gathering. Throughout the many years the game has existed, players have been given expectations of what certain products should play and feel like. For instance, every time that there is an expansion set on the plane of Theros, there is the general expectation that the set will in some way have us caring about enchantments, because we have been conditioned to expect that from the plane of Theros. This also happens with newer sets. Even though we've only been to the plane of Kaldheim once, if we ever returned, I would still expect us to see the snow mechanic, because it feels essential to the plane's identity, and it would be super weird to me if snow just didn't appear. Just like how it'd be weird if we would go to Theros and the set didn't care about enchantments, or if we went to a plane like Ravnica and the set didn't care about guilds for some reason. So unfortunately, because of that little Commander Legends moniker, players had built up some expectations of what Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate should be. Also, for the sake of everybody, I'm now just going to be referring to it as Battle for Baldur's Gate because it will be very repetitive if I say the entire title every time. Now clearly, the title was to indicate to players that this was another draftable commander set. However, many players expected Battle for Baldur's Gate to also have many of the other aspects that made the original Commander Legends so beloved. I know it may seem kind of silly to think that a name contributed to the failure of a set, but Mark Rosewater himself, the head designer of Magic the Gathering, even stated in his 2022 State of Design that the product should have been labeled differently since players developed incorrect expectations. So what were those expectations? Well, as I mentioned before, other than the draft experience, people enjoyed the original Commander Legends because it contained callbacks to iconic Magic lore and characters, they saw printings of new, fun, and powerful cards, and needed reprints of iconic and valuable cards. And unfortunately, Battle for Baldur's Gate struggled on almost all of these fronts. For one, Baldur's Gate is just not Magic IP, so we can chuck that one in the garbage. Moving on to the next point, the original Commander Legends was the origin of many now iconically powerful cards, like Jeweled Lotus, Jezka's Will, Opposition Agent, Hullbreacher, Akroma's Will, Sakashima of 1,000 Faces, and many more cards. However, Battle for Baldur's Gate kinda lacked any of these really flashy cards. While the set generally had cards that were still fun, and also a handful of cards here and there that were pretty powerful, none of them generated even close to the same level of excitement that players had for those original Commander Legends cards. This was also a really big problem since Battle for Baldur's Gate also didn't deliver on that final bullet point: reprints. Unfortunately, Magic the Gathering cards can get pretty expensive. So over time, Wizards of the Coast will sneak in reprints of powerful cards into their products to both help players by giving new printings, which should in turn lower the price of these cards, but also having known powerful cards in a product will help sell it, since customers already know that something valuable is available. And in this area, the main advantage that a Commander product has over a typical standard set is that Commander is an eternal format, meaning that almost every card in Magic's history, with the small exception of those on the ban list, are playable in the format. So a card getting reprinted in a Commander set wouldn't affect its legality in other formats like Standard or Modern or Pioneer. But if you reprint an old powerful card like, let's say, Vampiric Tutor, in a standard legal set, you've now just introduced this card to a bunch of formats that are not equipped to handle a card of that power level, making these Commander sets great opportunities to reprint powerful old cards that would break formats like Standard or Modern. And the original Commander Legends took full advantage of this, reprinting really strong cards like Scroll Rack, Mana Drain, and Vampiric Tutor. And unfortunately, Battle for Baldur's Gate lacked any of these big name reprints in the main set, with probably the best ones being Kindred Discovery and like Ramble Sovereign, which are fine, but nowhere near the same level as Mana Drain or Vampiric Tutor. And this lack of big name reprints was really frustrating for players, since at the time, there were a ton of Commander cards that were in desperate need of a reprint. And while players were frustrated by these missing reprints, they wouldn't need to wait very long. Whenever a new Magic the Gathering set releases, Wizards of the Coast does something called spoiler season, during which they give out new cards to news outlets and content creators for them to reveal on a specified date. It allows the overall Magic community to have a long discussion about specific cards, and also provides a great topic for content creators to make videos about, articles about, and social media posts for. And this is an essential part of Wizards of the Coast's marketing strategy, and it's a great way to get players excited for upcoming sets, since hardcore players will likely be brainstorming and theorizing about how to use new upcoming cards. And when you're thinking about these cards so much, you're inherently more likely to buy them. So it can be a pretty big issue for Wizards when this spoiler season gets disrupted. And unfortunately, for Battle for Baldur's Gate, that is exactly what happened. About 2 months prior to the set's release, a significant portion of the set's cards were leaked onto social media, which was a pretty devastating blow to the hype going into the release of Battle for Baldur's Gate. While the leak definitely hurt the excitement for the set, it was actually Wizards of the Coast themselves that landed the killing blow. One of the biggest criticisms about Wizards in recent years has been the deluge of new Magic products, making Magic a very difficult game for even the most enfranchised players to keep up with. And a prime example of this was the release of the product Double Masters 2022, which came out less than a month after Battle for Baldur's Gate. Double Masters 2022 was a part of the long-standing Master series of sets, which are all reprint sets, in which they reprint a vast number of popular and heavily played cards. And Wizards of the Coast started advertising this set immediately after the release of Battle for Baldur's Gate, with spoiler season for Double Masters starting just 6 days after Battle for Baldur's Gate's release date. And it was incredibly clear that Double Masters had a bunch of cards that were reprinted specifically for the Commander format, considering the set was full of Commander All-Stars like Teferi's Protection, Mana Drain, Phyrexian Altar, Consecrated Sphinx, Smothering Tithe, and of course, the infamous Dockside Extortionist. The set also contained cards for other formats like Modern, but it was very clear that a ton of slots were dedicated specifically for Commander players. Considering that along with the expensive reprints I just mentioned, the set was also filled with new arts and foiling treatments for fan favorite Commanders and other popular staples. And given the large amount of valuable reprints in Double Masters, many players reasonably decided to skip over Battle for Baldur's Gate, since a high-value reprint set was just around the corner. If Wizards of the Coast did a better job at spacing out their releases, I don't think that Battle for Baldur's Gate would have done this badly. Ideally, one of these two sets would have been pushed back to a later date. And personally, I think out of the two, Battle for Baldur's Gate should have been delayed for. I, like many others, fell in love with the world of Baldur's Gate thanks to the release of Baldur's Gate 3. And I'm sure you don't need me to tell you, but Baldur's Gate 3 was a massive success. As of the recording of this video, the game has sold over 20 million copies and swept the 2023 Game Awards, which is impressive in its own right, but it's even more impressive in one of the most stacked years in gaming. So it's kind of insane to me that the Magic the Gathering set based on Baldur's Gate came out over a year before Baldur's Gate 3 did, because I know that myself and likely many others would have been way more interested in buying a Baldur's Gate themed set now versus when Battle for Baldur's Gate actually released. And I'm sure that many people who've never played Magic before, or maybe dropped it at some point, would be willing to pick the game up if they had a dedicated set for Baldur's Gate 3, especially considering how successful the Lord of the Rings set was. And what's really unfortunate is that because the Magic the Gathering set came out before Baldur's Gate 3, it influenced the design of the Baldur's Gate 3 characters. I had this distinct moment while playing Baldur's Gate 3 where I remember that this set existed. And I remember excitedly going to Scryfall to see how they represented these characters as Magic cards. And I also remember being insanely disappointed. Like, Oh, Asterion, cares about life loss and life gain. I guess that makes sense because he's a vampire. Karlach, she does extra combats. Guess that makes sense since she gets an extra attack from being a barbarian. Oh, Will, you let me roll dice twice. I guess there are some times where you can get advantage, I suppose. And Lae'zel. Why do you care about counters exactly? It's so frustrating that all of these characters feel just so generic as magic cards. I made this point in my Universes Beyond video, but I want to reiterate it here. That the main reason that these designs feel so generic is that they're built off the early access build of Baldur's Gate 3. While I understand why the designs are the way that they are, it's still deeply disappointing from somebody who fell in love with these characters. And I honestly really hope they try to set another set in the universe of Baldur's Gate, because there is so much potential to build off here. These characters deserve cards that are special, and are carefully crafted to represent who they are with their own mechanical identity. And that's another major problem with this set, is that it doesn't feel special. Every Magic the Gathering set has the responsibility of creating and developing its own mechanical identity, and this is often done by introducing new mechanics while still bringing back some old ones. For instance, the set Wilds of Eldraine introduces the new mechanics Bargain and Rolls, but also brought back and built upon the existing adventure mechanic from Throne of Eldraine, making the set feel fresh with new mechanics while still improving upon older ones. The new mechanics help the game stay fresh, and it's something that Battle for Baldur's Gate is severely lacking in. Battle for Baldur's Gate brought back the following mechanics: Goad, Myriad, Adventures, Dice Rolling, and Gates, and they introduced the new mechanics Choose a Background and the Initiative. It was very fun to see these returning mechanics, with Myriad specifically being a particular highlight thanks to it being a while since we had last seen it. The exciting part for a lot of new sets is the new mechanics that they introduce, and one of the main issues with Battle for Baldur's Gate is that these quote-unquote new mechanics don't actually feel new. To represent the character building aspect of Dungeons & Dragons, the design team came up with Choose a Background. With this mechanic, you can now start with 2 cards in the command zone rather than just 1. One of these cards is a legendary creature with the Choose a Background mechanic, and the other one being an enchantment with the background subtype. And honestly, this is a great idea. The Choose a Background mechanic does a great job at representing how backgrounds work in Dungeons & Dragons. And it also provides a fun way for players to customize their commander decks by giving them a ton of different options and combinations to choose from. The issue is that we've seen this before. This is just another in the long series of variations on the partner mechanic. The partner mechanic was created in 2016 and allowed you to have 2 commanders in your command zone rather than just 1, as long as they both had the partner mechanic. The partner mechanic was super strong, so they've been creating variations on it as a way to tone down its power level a little bit. So in the set Battle Bond, they introduced the partner with mechanic, and this version allowed you to have 2 creatures in your command zone, but those 2 could only be paired with each other. Take Okon Eye of Chaos and Zindersplint Eye of Wisdom as an example. Then for the Stranger Things Secret Lair, they introduced Friends Forever, which was functionally identical to partner, but it was limited to only work with creatures that had Friends Forever rather than every possible creature that has partner. Then they also revisited the partner mechanic again in the original Commander Legends, this time toning it down so the partners were only monocolored legends rather than the multicolored legends in the original printing. So given all of this, it didn't make Choose a Background feel all that special. It felt like another flavorful addition to the long-standing tradition of making a variation on partner. And despite not really feeling that special, it was still received pretty well, because the flavor felt good for the set, and overall, partner is still a fun mechanic, so having another variation isn't that much of an issue. So most people in the community liked it. The Initiative, on the other hand, is one of the most hated, and one of the most poorly designed Magic the Gathering mechanics that they have ever made. The initiative mechanic is a combination of the venture into the dungeon mechanic from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms and the monarch mechanic from the set Conspiracy Take the Crown. The monarch mechanic is considered to be one of the best multiplayer mechanics that Magic the Gathering has ever made. When the monarch's introduced into the game, if somebody is the monarch, at their end step they draw a card. And whenever a creature deals combat damage to a player that is the monarch, the player who controlled the attacking creature will take the monarch from them. This mechanic is super fun and encourages a lot of back and forth swings and creates really fun and interesting situations. Given how popular this mechanic is and how many fun gameplay scenarios it creates, it makes a lot of sense why they would want to build upon this mechanic for Battle for Baldur's Gate. However, the main issue is that they combine it with the venture into the dungeon mechanic, which, unlike Monarch, was not well received. The goal of the venture mechanic was to represent the dungeon part of Dungeons & Dragons. Whenever you venture into a dungeon for the first time, you get to choose one of these 3 iconic dungeons from Dungeons & Dragons. And the first time you venture into them, the effect in the first listed room occurs. Then, if you venture into the dungeons again, you move on to the next room. Once you reach the last room in a dungeon, you have now completed it, which means that the next time you venture into the dungeon, you can now once again choose from one of those starting 3 dungeons. Needless to say, this mechanic is very complicated and also is not particularly intuitive since it requires you to track something outside of the typical game of Magic, plus the reminder text doesn't really explain how a dungeon works. This mechanic is also pretty miserable to play with if you don't have one of these dungeon tokens on hand. Players didn't love this mechanic, with most people being either indifferent or just straight up hating it. The professor from Tolarian Community College, aka the most popular Magic the Gathering YouTube channel, actually even cited it as the 3rd worst mechanic that Magic has ever made. This mechanic was also pretty weak power level wise, since a majority of the ways that you venture into the dungeon were relatively mana intensive, and none of the room abilities were particularly worth that level of investment. Back to the actual initiative mechanic, it functions just like Monarch, passing from player to player whenever creatures deal combat damage to them. But now, whenever you take the initiative, and also at the beginning of your upkeep, you venture into the Undercity. Now you may be wondering, what's the Undercity? Well, the Undercity is a new dungeon that functions identically to the dungeons from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. But this time, instead of being able to choose one of the 3 that you were able to in Forgotten Realms, you now venture into a new dungeon designed just for Battle for Baldur's Gate, the Undercity. Unless you're already in one of those existing dungeons, then you progress through that dungeon instead until you complete it. So once again, not a particularly intuitive design. It's weird that there's corner cases like this, and a lot of players were pretty confused once this mechanic first came out. Also, this is just like a personal pet peeve. Why do they call this mechanic initiative? This functions nothing like the way initiative functions in Dungeons & Dragons, so just seems like a weird naming choice to me. On top of just generally being confusing, this mechanic is also super annoying to play with, since each player has to track their own individual progress throughout the dungeon, essentially meaning that each player in the game has to have their own separate token or tracker, even if they weren't the player that brought the initiative mechanic to the game. The Undercity was also designed to be more powerful than the dungeons in Forgotten Realms, and it was clearly designed to be impactful in a game of Commander. Which, is fine, it makes sense, the power level should be higher for a Commander product, but where this becomes a problem is in other Eternal formats. The main disadvantage of a mechanic like Initiative in Commander is that it can be easily taken from you, since usually you're going to be defending it from around 3 other players. However, in a 1 versus 1 format, you only have to defend against 1 other player, making it way easier for you to hold on to the initiative. And this creates a massive problem because the Undercity isn't only strong in Commander, it's really strong in a 1 versus 1 game, since the impact of each of these abilities is way larger when you only have 2 players at 20 health versus 4 at 40. So the introduction of the initiative caused a massive issue in both Pauper and Legacy, since in both formats you can easily rush out and defend the initiative, and it lets you accrue a ton of value over the course of 1 game, leading to the cards White Plume Adventurer being banned in Legacy, and in Pauper the cards Stirring Bard, Vicious Battle Mage, Underdark Explorer, and Aarakocra Sneak were banned as well. And despite all these bannings, the initiative is still really strong in these formats, meaning that players still have to deal with this clunky and annoying mechanic, even though their decks probably weren't even built around it. Perhaps introducing a more unique feeling and ideally more balanced mechanic would have helped made this set feel a little bit more appealing to the average player, since to myself and many others, this set just mechanically feels like a lot more of the same, rather than something that truly feels new. I know that I'm being harsh about all this, and that generally this has been a pretty negative video, but I do want to highlight that this set is actually pretty beloved by some people, and there are some legitimate reasons why people would like this set. While not too many people actually drafted this set, those that did had a very positive experience, and most people said it was a major improvement upon the original Commander Legends. This set also introduced some pretty fun new commanders with some interesting niche designs, like Nine Fingers Kel being a fun Gates commander, Raga Draga being this cool Mana Dork tribal commander, and Miram just being the most insanely broken dragon commander I've ever seen. We also saw some really fun cards being printed, like the Ancient Dragon Cycle, a bunch of cool new card draw spells in white, and weird cards like Mirror of Life Trapping. And while it's not my ideal version of any of these characters, it's still pretty cool to see that these characters that I grew so attached to in Baldur's Gate 3 are also in Magic the Gathering. I hope that this isn't the end for draftable commander sets, or that it's the end for Dungeons & Dragons or Baldur's Gate sets, because these ideas have a ton of potential, and I would love to see Wizards try this idea again. But if they do, I want them to swing for the fences a little bit more, and try and create something that feels more fun and a bit more unique. And I know Wizards is capable of this. They've done it many times before. And if you want to see me talk in length about one of the times that Wizards really tried something experimental, then you should check out my video on Future Sight.